Robots, bugs, and even other animals seem like little aliens. They exist in different realms than us. They sense the world differently than us. They eat, breathe, and sleep differently than us. We don't need to go to other planets to experience aliens. The aliens are already here. We read stories of going to war with people different than ourselves. Fiction is written about the problem of existing in tandem with species that we don't see eye to eye with. But these species are no mere science fiction. They exist no matter how much we might want to ignore them. And instead of negotiating our space with them, instead of finding common ground, we turn them into science experiments. It's easy enough with the right perspective. They exist in a category outside human. Human, obviously, and other creatures similar enough, human-like, those creatures, they deserve protection. But the bugs? Never. Never the bugs. Don't kill bugs. That's right, don't kill bugs. But why shouldn't you? Sometimes bugs are annoying, they kind of land on you, spiders are maybe a little creepy. They can be almost alien in a way. I'm going to foreshadow a little bit. We shouldn't kill bugs because bugs are conscious creatures. But first, let's get started with some genealogy and look at how our beliefs, how we see the world, how we decide that bugs aren't human, other creatures unlike us aren't human. All of these beliefs are structured by our experiences of the world. The most famous author concerned with genealogy is Friedrich Nietzsche. With the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche proposed that our morals are not given to us by God, nor are they a scientific fact that we can discover. Instead, morals are created by humans based on dominant and non-dominant group beliefs. He calls this the master and slave morality. For example, rich people believe that money is good and believe in utilitarianism, while poor people believe that suffering is a virtue and believe in something like Kantian ethics, or the idea that every person has equal value, and that we can't harm human life. This is just a rough sketch, but this is an example of the type of beliefs Nietzsche would say are just structured by our environment. These social positions, according to Nietzsche, structure our moral systems. Morals can't be objective, because they are intricately tied to our social and cultural systems people live in. Whether you believe this or not, this gives us an interesting perspective to look at morality. Morality isn't, according to Nietzsche, something given to us by God, or an objective fact of the universe that we have to discover. Morality is something learned, something that changes according to your experiences. Morality, under this perspective, is more subjective, more gross, and less perfect than many philosophers like to admit. Rationality isn't the core source of moral enlightenment. The facts of our existence aren't something transcendent or beyond doubt. Nietzsche challenges the objective facts. He presents a skeptical view of morality. A complete acceptance of his conclusion regarding the genealogy of our beliefs could lead us to say something like there's no difference between people touting conspiracy theories and a data-based understanding of the world, because if we're all brought up in a specific culture and fed information from the things around us, then it seems like we can all be influenced by these subjective things changing our beliefs. If this is the case, maybe we can't know anything about anything. If we say human genealogies of knowledge mean we can't know anything, we succumb to a vacuum of skepticism. All the world is unknowable. We can't know whether we exist. We can't use science to guide us in the world. Everything of the external world tells us nothing. It's just lies. Everything is subjective and randomly influenced by the culture we grew up in, and a bunch of other random facts. Knowledge is just chaos. We are only chaos. That is our destiny in the universe, to drift aimlessly, purposelessly throughout the universe. On the other hand, this specific view of morality has caused many modern-day philosophers to scoff at Nietzsche. How, dare they say, could philosophy, ethics itself, that dictates for how we behave, be influenced by subjective, gross facts, like how we grow up? No, they say, wrong, impossible. My philosophy is distant from the concerns of the plebeians. I use logic and reason to understand philosophy. The genetic fallacy is used to describe the situation. This is the idea that logic and reason that what is right no matter where it comes from. For example, if Hitler said rape is bad, it wouldn't be bad just because Hitler said it. Moral truths are truths beyond where they came from, beyond the circumstances of the past. These philosophers might stare incredulously at Nietzsche and scoff. How could you say something like murder or rape could ever be right? And this isn't wrong. There's something that is unobjectionable. That there are basic things that are right and wrong. There's some things that we can know and some things that we can't. There's a difference between your uncle, the conspiracy theorist, just taking a guess, explaining the data, and the scientist explaining the data. But on the other hand, scientists and these analytic philosophers seem to be missing something crucial. It is true that the way we see the world is influenced by where we grow up, the schools we were taught in, our parents. Some philosophers like to pretend that they exist beyond the world because they look at the world through the eyes of reason and rationality. By doing this, they miss out on half of the picture. Logic and rationality are important, but they are informed and work in tandem with emotions and first-person experience. If we accept their view of the world, we lose equally important information. We are so distanced from the world that we ignore the world in favor of abstract questioning. This type of theorizing can be equally as problematic as the skeptical reading of Nietzsche. Instead of theorizing nothing exists, philosophers theorize of grand imaginary abstract entities. They theorize of worlds existing only in the mind, and in a world so real and visceral, so influenced by us, and perception so tied to our experience of other people in the world, the extra-rationalist explanation does not explain our life. It doesn't explain what it's like to actually live and experience the world. Modern-day philosopher extraordinaire and Oxford professor Amiya Srinivasan talks about this dilemma in a couple of her papers. The paper I will talk about specifically is Genealogy and World-Making. She tries to thread the needle between the things we can know and the things that we should be more skeptical of because of where they came from, between truth and our messy experience of the world. In the end of her paper, she offers a different way to use Nietzsche's genealogy. Instead of seeing him as someone who believes that there can be no sort of objective morality, we can see Nietzsche as a philosophical historian, a person using philosophy to uncover our biases and to help us see how the culture, places we were brought up, can obscure the truth. On this non-skeptical view of Nietzsche, just because we are influenced by outside influences, just because the world can shift and change the way we view knowledge, doesn't mean that we can't have any objective of what makes up knowledge. And this seems right, because for most of our life, it seems obvious that we can know things. The strongest evidence in the universe points to this knowledge tracking somewhat with the way the world is. When we believe and think about certain things, those things track with the world. I make a piece of toast, and when I move over to the toast, it's still there. The world isn't just chaos and randomness, but instead acts in accordance with regular patterns. This seems unobjectionable. I don't leave my shoes only to have them disappear into a quantum value. Knowledge has value. If this seems true to you, then the question is how we use the genealogy. The project of a critical genealogist is to uncover the structures that obscure the fundamental truths that obscure our knowledge. As critical genealogists, it is our task to brush the dust off the infinite latticework of the universe. Why is this relevant to you? I have a couple answers for you. This is relevant because it changes how you orient yourself to the world. Is your goal in the universe to drift aimlessly because you can never know anything? Or can you know things about the world and possibly interact with the world in a meaningful way? Although there are a lot of different questions combined here, knowledge does provide an important background to many of them. If we can't have knowledge of anything, this seems to take out the possibility of us interacting with the world in a meaningful way. Meaning and knowledge are different things, but without knowledge of the world, it seems tougher to build meaning. Right now, we will work with the background assumption that you can know and not know some things about the world. Genealogies don't prevent knowledge, instead, genealogies shape knowledge creation. Here I'd like to look at different times and places to show how the different attitudes, beliefs, etc. influence the metaphysical beliefs of the time, or the beliefs about the fundamental underlying structure of reality. Then I want to provide a solution to reshape our genealogies, to give everyone the genealogical luck to treat other creatures and people respectfully. By the end of it, I hope you'll join me in looking closely at the structures around you that shape your knowledge, and how those things stop you from finding the truth. A hint, there are a couple monsters that lie at the center of this web, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. To start off, throughout this video I'm going to look at the metaphysical beliefs of consciousness and how our understanding of what constitutes consciousness has been shaped by our genealogy. Before we get further, let's define consciousness. In its most simple and obvious definition, consciousness is an awareness. It is what its likeness of experience. I'll be using a couple definitions, relying on a couple definitions throughout this video. One of them is David Chalmers. If we reflect on anything that consciousness could be, Something like a what it is likeness of experience seems correct. If we look to other places, if we look and research and really think about it, it's hard to isolate consciousness in any specific brain structure. We could say something like neural circuitry and the neurochemical systems that communicate with each other in the brain. We could say that's consciousness. But this sort of idea that consciousness is just something in the brain, it seems wrong. And now I'm going to give 2 examples to motivate why this seems wrong. There are two examples that motivate the idea that describing the structure or function of the brain will never be able to explain the inner experience, the what it's likeness of consciousness. One is the idea of a philosophical zombie. This is the idea that we can imagine a part-for-part replica of a human being, of all the neurons, of the body, but that person doesn't have the what it's likeness of experience. This is a data point that shows that it seems impossible to unite the principles of structure and function of description with our experience of consciousness. It seems very easily imaginable that we could have consciousness without the structure and function of consciousness, or, on the other hand, that we could have the structure and function, but there is nowhere to be found the what it's likeness of consciousness. 2 is the idea of Mary's room. This is a philosophical thought experiment where Mary is a color scientist who knows all of the physical facts about color, but she herself hasn't experienced color. One day, Mary gets some futurist new science surgery to allow her to see color. When she sees or experiences color, the idea is that she experiences some new information that she couldn't have gotten from knowing all of the physical facts about color. This leads people to say that consciousness, at the base, at least can't be defined as something that is just a physical thing, or physical phenomenon, at least in the way we understand physical today. At first, we must reference our data of consciousness, understand the world, and then we can look for explanation of the data point. But it's important to point out that these examples that I've given, they are data, and as it turns out, they aren't very easy to explain away. Here's a quote from Thomas Nagel that also gives us a little bit more insight into what sort of thing consciousness could be. Conscious experience is a widespread phenomenon. It occurs at many levels of animal life, though we can't be sure of its presence in simpler organisms, and it is very difficult to say in general what provides evidence of it. Some extremists have been prepared to deny it even of mammals other than man. No doubt it occurs in countless forms totally unimaginable to us on other planets and other solar systems throughout the universe, but no matter how the form may vary, the fact that an organism has conscious experience at all means basically that there is something that it is like to be that organism. There may be further implications about the form of the experience. There may even be, though I doubt it, an implication about the behavior of the organism. But fundamentally, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there's something that it is like to be that organism, something it is like for that organism. We call this the subjective character of experience. It is not captured in any of the familiar, recently devised reductive analyses of the mental, for all of them are logically compatible with its absence. It is not analyzable in terms of any explanatory system of functional states or intentional states, since these could be ascribed to robots or automata that behave like people, though they experienced nothing. And Nagel's definition and Chalmers, a combination of these, is pretty close to the working definition I'm going to use throughout this video. We're not just robots, not automaton, just messy, beautiful living creatures. Calling some people and animals conscious while denying others has been a popular tactic throughout history. Now I'm going to explore that a little, show how historical, sociological, and political structures limit our imaginations and our understanding of consciousness. Hello, universe. Where am I? What am I? Am I just a mind drifting in a vat controlled by an evil scientist distorting my view of the world? The jury's still out, but probably not. But questions like these have plagued people's minds for most of recorded history. And I want to explain here how our views of consciousness and the time these views were made in are intertwined. The views we have are shaped by the times we are in, but this is not a one-way relationship, because the views we have also shape the sorts of actions we take in the world. Descartes asks how a thinking, immaterial thing can influence the body. His idea was that there were two different types of substances. People are made of two separate substances, the material substance and the immaterial substance, the soul. Something could be a thinking thing or a material thing, but not both. Now the question is, how did Descartes get to the point of positing a soul and a body as completely distinct entities? By logic, of course. First, he needed to know how we could know anything about the world. He imagined himself in a sort of simulation being tricked by an evil demon. As a side note, the Matrix was also influenced by Descartes, and in this situation he asked himself if he could know anything. Even if he was tricked by an evil demon, he thought that he could still know that he was a thinking sort of thing, because even if your whole world is made up, it must be made up somewhere. You must at least have thoughts. From there, he built up his system of knowledge to prove the foundation of things we can know. We can then use the principles of the mind to deduce other things about the world. Thus, for Descartes, we found out about our external experiences of the world by using deductive principles. Then he asks what the difference is between the mind and the body. The mind is a thinking thing and the body is not a thinking thing. One is extended, has shape, and the other is constant, can't be divided, so boom. Using deduction, they are different, because it seems like one of these things can experience color, taste, imagination, while the other, physical substance, cannot. It can be divided, and the mind's experience cannot be, according to Descartes. The physical can be an illusion, the mind, the experience of thinking, cannot. A quote from Descartes, "When I consider the mind or myself insofar as I am merely a thinking thing, I am unable to distinguish any part within myself. I understand myself to be something quite single and complete." We have the theory. Descartes believed in the soul and looked to use deduction and logic to prove that there must be a soul, that God exists somewhere. In the infinity, Descartes looked, and he saw God. Taking a critical genealogist perspective, we could say that Descartes was influenced to see how certain things worked, or rather, to only see certain things based on his beliefs in God, in the soul. He wanted so badly to prove his beliefs that he didn't look beyond his influences. The era he existed in shaped him, shaped his beliefs. But it's quite clear that this wasn't a one-way relationship. It wasn't just Descartes' beliefs, but the beliefs in a soul that shaped a whole religious generation. Let's look at the background beliefs, culture, social themes that Descartes influences, and that influenced Descartes to see the world divided into souls and bodies. Now I'd like to open on the Protestant Reformation. Descartes existed in early modern Europe, which was a tumultuous time and place. Religion ruled supreme as a high council of priests determined the rules and dictates of society. The Bible was written in Latin, and only a small number of select priests could read Latin. This group determined how society was ordered. The Pope in 1515 declared that special indulgences were the best way to release someone from purgatory and get them to heaven. Just buy one and you can be free. Examples of religion influencing people's lives are well known with the Salem witch trials and the general hatred to witchcraft and bad magic. Malleus Maleficarum was a text on witchcraft and a misogynistic text exposing the dangers of witchcraft, which, according to a historian, led to more vulnerable women being tried in this quest to extinguish the devil from modern civilization. During this time, the Jesuits created schools to spread Catholicism, hiding as spies in different countries to propagate technology, establishing schools to spread their ideas, etc. And during this time, we find at the center of the story, and one of the most influential philosophers of the time, Descartes, a devotee of these Catholic schools looking to prove the order of his society was correct, looking for an explanation of God, looking to banish the demons, while praising God. Genealogy shapes our outlook on the world in important ways. Descartes wanted to see God because his whole life was premised upon this fact. His considerable logical skills to meditate on the existence of two different substances, a thinking one and a physical non-thinking one. It might be easy for some people today to laugh at this, but it wasn't easy to live in a world persecuted for witchcraft if you didn't believe the dominant ideology, a world where infinite hell or splendor was at stake if you made the wrong decision. Descartes wasn't at the center of the religious movement, but he wasn't at the periphery either. This is an example of genealogy being complicated and moving in multiple directions. The Church influenced Descartes, and Descartes influenced the Church. I'm sure the Catholic Church used Descartes' erudition to help fuel their already burgeoning ideas of humankind as a special kind of people. If you get to say that people have souls, while animals and other people dissimilar from you don't, that makes you seem more like God's special people. Thus, the infinite self-propagation loop continues. Beliefs and the distinction of the body and the soul explain religious superiority, and the metaphysical background beliefs help explain how religion has such an easy time justifying their superiority. Descartes sits at the precipice of the new revolution in science. He looks back at the age of religion and tries to tie down our understanding of the mind using reasoning. During the scientific revolution, Descartes wanted to describe the world. He wanted to understand the mind's place in the world. Still being influenced by the dregs of religion, he used his deductive method to posit the entity of the soul, a deductive method that looked to unite our information and our understanding of the world, succeeded for the next couple of 100 years. The belief in the soul and mind-body dualism isn't primarily a part of the Dark Ages, surprisingly. It may have its origins during this time, and it may have most obviously influenced the world during that time. But today most people probably believe in something like mind-body dualism, at least most religious people, that there is a difference between the mind and the body. These background metaphysical beliefs can influence people more than they might realize. For one, it is clear today that many religions still use the idea of the soul as a key part of their doctrine. Catholicism says that we get to be immortal beings in heavenly splendor if we obey God, repent for our sins, etc. Tying these metaphysical beliefs to religious systems can make it seem, if you are religious, that not only are you more spiritually enlightened, but you also have more information about the structure of the universe. If we tie these two facts together, just as other religious-fueled rampages have happened, for example, the Salem witch trials, today people persecute others in part because they believe that they are the arbiters of a universal justice, that if you don't follow God's laws, you are fated to be stranded in hell for the rest of your life. This makes it easier to say that gay people and anyone that you may have already believed is inferior needs to repent for their sins. I'm not saying that these metaphysical beliefs are the only underlying cause of these difficulties in seeing beyond a worldview, but that there are self-referencing loops in belief systems where time and circumstances and background influence the metaphysical beliefs, and metaphysical background beliefs help reinforce these beliefs. This is not a question of whether the chicken or the egg came first. This is a question about the underlying facts that cause people to see some things as true and some things as false, and the complicated relationship between these things and the other webs of beliefs that people have. Genealogy and background metaphysical beliefs do influence the world, and the world influences these beliefs. Now fast forward to a couple hundred years, right into the scientific revolution and the information age. Science is the new god. All hail the god named science. They are the one who will show us to a new, better world. Science heals, science knows, and science is always watching. Instead of seeing ghosts and demons hiding in every corner, we use the universal laws of the universe to describe how the universe works. The universe is a physical sort of thing affected by physical laws. We can use this information to make electricity, cars, medicine, reshape the natural world, including global warming. The air of scientism has pervaded the study of the mind as well as the study of most other things. Science is looked at as the most important tool to study the world. We look at certain types of data with certain types of instruments, and boom, it has been induced. We can figure out how the world works. The scientific method and its principles have influenced philosophy as much as everything else. For example, the progress of mathematics caused philosophers to tie their philosophical progress to a very mathematical and scientific understanding of language. This revolution in philosophy for a time narrowed the scope of philosophy to clarifying logical meaning within the structure of language. This meant that questions about God and other similar topics, any interesting topics, were disregarded. These types of questions couldn't be clearly answered without looking at the logical structures of language, so they were unanswerable and unimportant to this new narrowed realm of philosophy. The only real philosophy was philosophy that could be verified with data. This was called the logical positivist movement in philosophy. From this school of thought arose a view of consciousness known as analytical behaviorism. This philosophical school of thought's main idea was that we can understand the nature of thought and consciousness by looking at behavioral cues. Behaviorists said that we can understand what a mental state is based only on external observations of the state. For example, pain is just a collection of external dispositions like rubbing your head, complaining of a headache, and other cues that are commonly associated with pain. There is no way to understand behavior besides our outside observation of behavior events. Under this theory of consciousness, mental states don't have any extra meaning beyond what is externally verifiable. This influenced a large number of scientists and philosophers. B.F. Skinner and even Charles Darwin used behaviorism to delineate how the world worked. For Skinner, there were not internal free spirits in animals or people. The only thing at the center of any consciousness is controllable stimulus and response. We are just creatures meant to be trained to respond or not respond to stimuli. Any experience of the world that doesn't line up with the external observation isn't real because it can't be verified. Now, let's look at the scientific process to understand how this way of thinking was applied to philosophy, and generally, how science falls prey to the same sort of genealogical problems that philosophy does. First, I'm going to use Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions to explain how science works. There are a couple of stages in science according to Kuhn. The first stage is normal science. A period of normal science is when scientists are united under one paradigm. Kuhn talks about this period as a sort of dogmatic consensus. An example of how this process works is theories of light, photons today versus the wave theory versus the corpuscular theory in the 1800s. These are all different paradigms that normal science looks to validate. An example of success in normal science is an experiment that confirms the result of these paradigms. Any experiment that doesn't is said to be an error and disregarded. Kuhn says that before the scientific revolution, science was not consensus-based, but instead just based on different schools of thought with different interpretations. Think of ancient Greece and the different theories on matter. Kuhn says that science only became science when this different approach was abandoned. Normal science to Kuhn is mainly a process of problem solving, or puzzle solving. When solving a puzzle in normal science, it is not the paradigm that is tested, but the scientist. For example, if a scientist tries to find gravitational waves and fails to find gravitational waves, the scientist is a failure because the result did not conform to what is commonly known as correct. It is the scientist that needs to redo their experiment, not the idea of gravitational waves that need to be questioned. The next stage of science is crisis. Crisis happens when anomalies or things that contradict the paradigms need to be understood under the paradigm. Crises can happen when enough anomalies are found to confront the current consensus paradigm, and enough people question the paradigm and propose a new paradigm to understand the anomalies. This doesn't have to destroy the paradigm, and most of the time leads to a new explanation for how the paradigm needs to be reinterpreted to fit these anomalies. But if enough people lose faith in the paradigm, then a revolution occurs. Think Einstein's theory of general relativity. Specifically, revolution happens if there are enough problems that are difficult to solve under the current consensus paradigm that they destroy confidence in that paradigm. Kuhn makes an additional point on why revolution occurs. Crucially, what allows a revolution to happen are social, historical, and genealogical factors that allow the scientists to see the world in a different way. Under this model, science is not value neutral. Science is not just a collection of value neutral objective data and use of this data to prove a hypothesis. Scientific progress is influenced by randomness and the regular messy biases that cloud human decision making in other areas. It turns out, even the high beholden realm of science is not free from the influences of genealogy. Who would have guessed? So, what does this mean? I'm not here to tell you that we can't learn anything from science. Some skeptics about the nature of the world might take Kuhn to mean that science doesn't tell us anything about the world. This is another instance of a preposterous sort of skepticism. Instead of denying that any reality can be known from the scientific process, I want to examine why the process of only using science without looking at history and the social biases that cloud the scientific process lead to a limited and arbitrarily justified understanding of the world. First, let's look at this. The social context of justification, the duck-rabbit illusion. If I tell you this is a duck, you see it as a duck. If I tell you this is a rabbit, you see it as a rabbit. Kuhn uses this as an example to show how paradigms work for the interpretation of data in science. Like this illusion, the consensus of the time, social circumstance, and commonly understood scientific practices shape what counts as data and what doesn't count as data. What is a duck or a rabbit, or at least shapes the interpretation of this data. The paradigm allows science to ignore the data that isn't useful or doesn't fit the paradigm. Now, tying this back to B.F. Skinner, this is exactly what happened with the behavioral method of understanding human behavior, of consciousness. Skinner came up with a paradigm, and his external social biases, probably a collection of biases that included ideas like white supremacy, colonialism, anthropocentrism, etc., and these beliefs motivated him to try to prove that everything, or at least provided the background for what he could see as truth, and to prove that everything is stimulus and response. Any data, the variety of animal experiences, the times when things just aren't just stimulus and response in behavior, and the nearly universal intuitions regarding the nature of consciousness were all disregarded. Genealogy, our values, change the way we see things. Genealogy doesn't mean that we can't ever know things, but if we look at things in an unlucky way, that's being nice, we are doomed to miss important data. Let's expand a little bit on how the tradition of behaviorism is influential today, and how these genealogical influences linger in the crevices of our so-called carefully, rationally constructed beliefs. One example, behaviorists have justified a good lot of bigotry using their behavioral principles of science for things like ABA therapy, which treat autistic people as inhuman, because according to behaviorism, if autistic people's mannerisms observed by other people don't seem normal, then there must be something wrong with them. In fact, lack of traditional expression of emotions, according to someone like Skinner, might mean that you don't have traditional emotions. It's interesting to see how the cycle of biases reaffirming biases works. The behaviorist tradition has been used beyond this to try to show that there are natural ways of expressing emotions, and that these can be deduced using microexpressions and body language. This group of behaviorist influences continues today with people trying to explain people's body language on YouTube a lot of the time, and other places by reference, for example, FBI, CIA, by reference to fairly arbitrary markers of emotion that obviously vary depending on things such as social context of the situation, genealogy of the observer, and of course the internal state of the person, which can clearly vary without any behavioral change. And I wouldn't be surprised to see how many people have been tortured under behaviorist logic of seeing the truth in their lies. And now, to prove that this is wrong, for sure, for yourself if you still need it, here's an experiment you can try. Pinch yourself hard and don't grimace. In fact, don't make any face at all. See, you can feel something like a pain without there being an observable difference in your external expression of emotion. This isn't quite rocket science, but instead, this is another case of a faulty web of beliefs, a belief about the underlying nature of what makes a person conscious or capable of being human. The belief here is that all of consciousness could be mapped to external expression, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Animal behavior and training today is also still influenced by this outdated model. Scientists train mice, dogs, and other creatures under this version of stimulus response, and this ignores the experience of these animals. For example, octopuses change into a variety of colors for fun. This can't be explained just by reference to the outside observation of octopus behavior, but only by reference to consciousness. If we were to try to understand this behavior only by looking at the outside perception of it, we would have to say something just like the octopus changes color for seemingly no purpose. We can give no explanation of it. And that's all we can say because we can't reference any unobservable internal state that could cause the octopus or any animal to behave a certain way. Further, octopuses also demonstrate their phenomenal memory and are able to short-circuit lights and control and plan complicated escapes when under captivity. All traits and behaviors that would most likely be ignored if we just explained animal behavior in reference to stimulus and response. Elephants are also known for their strong memory, and creatures like chimpanzees develop complicated communication systems, advanced working memory, and a bevy of complicated emotions, attachment, sadness. But according to B.F. Skinner and people like Charles Darwin, if these animals don't display certain faces that mean that they are sad, happy, or angry, then it is impossible to say that these creatures can experience these emotions. Yeah, B.F. Skinner, it's very clear that the core of human and other animal life is the first-person experience of the world. There is no external report that can describe this. Computers beat people in chess, and the information age created new technologies, so philosophers, ever the bandwagoners, looked to provide an explanation that showed that computers weren't so different than brains. Brains are just a type of computer. This moved away from the idea of the soul and behaviorism instead to a reductive analogical argument. And that's being kind again. I want to call this revolution in philosophy the revolution of capitalism. The theories of competition and the market led people to declare capitalism as the new god. In place of religion, even in place of science, we worshiped the market. And computing technology, the stock market, these were our gods. Material accumulation, arbitrary inputs and outputs, the destruction of meaning, in service of this god fueled the revolution to just see the mind as another instance of the capitalist system, something to be exploited, something no different than a computer. At the same time, the beginning inventions of AI and the computer influenced many philosophers to think that the mind was just a computing system. Functionalism was the outcropping of this. Functionalism says, if certain brain states sit in an X functional relationship, then we get consciousness. There are inputs and outputs. If we get the inputs in the right way, like a computer, then we get a conscious being. Mark Fisher, in his book Capitalist Realism, quotes that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. The desire to exploit our environment to be the special bearers of knowledge is something that hasn't changed from our days looking for God and seeing demons hidden in every corner of existence. In late capitalism, it's easier to imagine that the mind is an extension of capitalism, to pray to our Lord and Savior Capital, than to imagine that we are more than our inputs and our outputs. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine that human beings aren't exploitable creatures, that we are vast hubs of unique consciousness, that we exist beyond economic value and scientific processes. As you might have guessed, this way of understanding the mind and consciousness is equally as flawed as the previous methods of understanding the mind. For some help in explaining why, I'm going to talk about John Searle and the Chinese room philosophy thought experiment. Imagine you are in a room and you are given a set of translation rules. Then a set of Mandarin characters are passed through the door. You must use this and the rules for how to manipulate the symbols to respond to the paper passed through the door. Eventually you get so good at this that the person observing on the outside can't tell the difference between a native Mandarin speaker and you in responding to these questions. Do you know Mandarin? John Searle says, no, you learn the symbols and how to move around the symbols in different orders, but you're still clueless about what they mean. Meaning, that's the real question. You aren't a computer. Your wet-brain complicated and messy architecture doesn't just process symbols and move them around in random predetermined ways. You are a meaning machine capable of making great art, of experiencing the world of taste, color, and beauty. You are human, you are conscious, and you are more than a machine. You are more than the ones and zeros, the electrical firings, as recorded by a computer, of your neural architecture. But why would you ever replace the human experience with a machine? Like the past epochs of history, the annals of late capitalism make it easy to say that humans are only machines to be exploited. We look to make sense of the story around us. Does it sound like a machine to you? It's only through restructuring our material circumstances, through imagining a different world, that we can see the world better, that we can see the world more clearly, that we can see more clearly what we really are. That I think is another pretty good explanation of capitalist mindset. If they can kill cows and pigs that way, we can build cars that way, Ford supposedly said after witnessing the disassembly lines at the Chicago meatpackers. Now we're going to go for some ways of kind of intertwining a data-based approach of the world with our understanding of consciousness, and thinking beyond neurons, beyond computational input and output, looking at the internal experience of creatures is the only way forward. Some scientists are starting to get the picture right. Science doesn't have to be so distant from these other types of data, but it's going to take some revolutions to get it right. This is a quote. This is from some science thing. The past shows us where neuroscience has been and how we can move forward. We first assume that the nervous systems control behavior, then realize the flaws in that framework. If the nervous system is just driving behavior, the way a person can drive a car, then studying the parts of this person won't explain how the car works, or why the person is driving in a particular direction. This idea also recalls the endlessly regressive homunculus argument, where the hard questions, how does this behavior happen, are delayed by creating one black box inside another, one mystery just beyond the grasp of the one right in front of you. Perhaps it's time for neuroscience to try out a new paradigm. Even if there is no doubt that neuroscience needs sophisticated technological tools, we need equally sophisticated models of how the many parts of the nervous system work together to make our movements serve specific goals. Already, we can sometimes become lost in the struggle to interpret the sea of data delivered by our tools. It's time to turn towards new models of the nervous system based on an adjusted set of assumptions. Another quote. There are many other examples where behavior led the way. By studying how owls listen for scurrying prey, neuroscience discovered how their brains and later those of mammals localize sound. By studying how marmosets call to each other, Ganzfar has learned more about the rules that govern turn-taking in human conversation. Critically, these cases began with studying behavior that the animals naturally do, not that they had been trained to perform. Likewise, bats, sea slugs, and electric fish have all told us something about how brains work, because each has its own specialized skill. If you pick a species that does one or two behaviors super well, you can identify the underlying circuits more clearly, Ganzfar says. Ganzfar continues, if your goal is to understand the brain, you have to understand behavior, and that's not trivial. I think a lot of neuroscientists think it is, he said. Perhaps one way forward would be to develop tools to help address the complexity of behavior, suggests Ed Boynton from MIT, who pioneered the breakthrough technique called optogenetics. Behavioral investigation has a strong tradition in neuroscience, and I hope it grows even stronger. Continuing from the article, the problem is that it's getting harder to publish such studies in flagship neuroscience journals. Behavioral studies get rejected for not having enough neuro, says Ganzfar, and it's as if every paper needs to be a methodological decathlon in order to be considered important. Science shapes our worldview, so instead of seeing human beings as complicated creatures with a vast internal experience, and other creatures as also complicated and worthy of protection, we go the opposite direction. We treat people as cogs in a machine, we treat animals as fuel for this machine, we exist only to be exploited. Our imagination is mapped out by science and used by capitalism. We can only imagine this world because that is the world we existed in, and the world we are told is the only one that can exist. Moral profits lead the way to justice. Just social systems change the way we view the world. A revolution in social systems can help us see the world for what it really is. We make our own luck. In the past, outdated ideas about how God influences the world, overzealous preachers seeing demons as an explanation for all of the evil of the world, and an over-reliance on external data, and a worship of the market obscured what we could see as data in the world, obscured the imagination we had, the possibilities we could see for our future. Here's another possibility: Panpsychism. Panpsychism is the theory that everything at the base is conscious. This theory, until more recently, was disregarded as absurd. If philosophers and psychologists took a theory like this as the core of our belief system, this would require us to restructure our worldview. Just like most knowledge, Western philosophers weren't the first to see this. The idea of panpsychism is that at the core of everything is consciousness. Descartes and other philosophers run up against something we've seen called the hard problem of consciousness. If the mind and the body are so different, how do they interact with each other? Other philosophers today come up with the same problem under functional and material understandings of consciousness. If our first-person conscious experience of the world is so different than the rest of the world, at least of our external observations of it, how is it that our consciousness can be connected to the physical world? To use a more modern example than Descartes could have, when I look at neurons, I don't see how I taste something. When I look at C fibers firing, I don't see how I experience pain. So how can these experiences be reduced using science to just neurons? And panpsychism agrees. Panpsychism says they can't. Panpsychism says that everything at its core is one substance: consciousness. It's important to note that this isn't saying that creatures are anthropomorphic, that everything has an awareness in the world. If this was true, that would mean things like electrons, basic particles, all have a sort of awareness. This isn't exactly what we want. If this was the case, we couldn't distinguish between the tables and people and animals. Instead, this is something that is compatible with the laws of physics. One thing we could say is that consciousness basically is present in everything in the universe. It is the basic substance behind everything, and what makes something aware and have the sort of phenomenal experience we have could emerge when X things combine in the right way. This is called emergentism, and is the idea that when particles combine in the right way, you get something different than the particles. It's important to note that this idea is supposed to unify science. This is not strictly something like animism. This is not the idea that every single thing in the universe has an awareness. Instead, this follows the idea that physics just explains the structural relations of the world. When we explain mass as a relationship of how forces work together. This does not explain the underlying intrinsic property of why this happens, why mass exists, what is mass. This place, at least according to Bertrand Russell, could be filled by consciousness. This is that the physical laws of the universe will all be possible to explain by referencing to consciousness. This would explain at the base the intrinsic thing that electrons, that mass are, why electrons behave the way they do. It explains how our thoughts and experiences influence the world. It explains subjective experiences because at the core of our neural architecture is one thing, At the core of everything is one thing, and that thing is consciousness. This solves two major problems associated with theories of consciousness. It solves the physicalist problems of reduction, of how a first-person experience of the world is not explainable under any reductionist physical system, and this solves the problems with dualist theories, namely the mind-body problem of how an immaterial substance can interact with a material substance. Panpsychism solves the biggest problem of reductive physical analyses of consciousness because it does not try to reduce consciousness to an input or an output or a neuron. These, as we've seen, fail to capture the first-person internal experiences of the world. Instead, Panpsychism unifies the experience of consciousness with the world by saying that everything is conscious at its base. It's not atoms that form the base of the world, not quarks, but conscious parts. You may say that this seems problematic because it seems like electrons are very different than human beings. Panpsychists would agree and say that the unity of different conscious parts is a possible explanation, another possible explanation of what gives us the what it is likeness to experience the world, while something like an atom or electron would have a very reduced or a non-unified consciousness, i.e. no awareness of the world, things arranged in different ways, have a sort of different awareness or experience of the world. This also solves the mind-body problem with dualism because there is no distinction between mental and physical substances. There is one thing, consciousness, that forms the base of our experience, so there is no need to appeal to a God or any sorts of mysterious linking principles to explain away the gap between mental things and physical things. The scientific revolution in capitalism obscured this viewpoint. It obscured the potential to think about the world like this. Hypercapitalism, atomism, and the reduction of science made us think that the world is just that. So what do we do about this? First, this idea of the world should make us reevaluate the science we do as it distances us from our first-person experience of the world, at least in regard to how science studies the brain, and the mind, and consciousness. If panpsychism is right, neurons, atoms, etc. are not the fundamental way to describe the universe. Consciousness is. There are a couple ways to see the project of combining the panpsychist view with science. One is suggested by Nancy Cartwright. The universal laws of the universe aren't universal and are only present in specific experimental situations that they are tested in. Nancy Cartwright uses the law of gravity as an example. Newton's law of gravity explains that as distance increases, the force of gravity decreases, but Nancy Cartwright then explains that it is crucial that this law doesn't apply in many cases, such as when other forces are present, like electromagnetism. It is important to note that scientists know this. There are different rules for when different forces are present, but Nancy Cartwright disagrees that these count as adequate explanations for laws. For example, when we try to explain other forces using things like vector laws that describe what happens when forces like gravity and electromagnetism are combined, Nancy Cartwright notes that the idea of a combination is a metaphor and doesn't make sense outside of that metaphor. The law of gravity doesn't posit a completely new force that is created and described differently when gravity is interacting with other forces. Yet outside of very ideal scenarios, this is how science works. Or rather, this is how science fails to work because it fails to describe what is actually going on outside of these very ideal cases. It is because of this that Nancy Cartwright suggests a patchwork universe with a variety of scientific laws for different circumstances to better explain the differences between the so-called universal laws and the way the universe actually works. Panpsychism could fill the gaps here, or at least give some explanation of why laws look so different in different circumstances. And panpsychism doesn't have to conflict with science. There's a very easy way for panpsychism to be consistent with the laws of science. Panpsychism just says it gives us another layer to understand science. Panpsychism says that everything at its base is conscious. So this doesn't necessarily need to posit new laws, although as we saw with Nancy Cartwright, it could, besides making our experience of the world, physics, consistent with our first-person experience of the world. The next question is, even if most people were to shift their underlying metaphysical beliefs to something more like panpsychism, how does this help us fix the way we see the world, and to see people as more than objects to be used and exploited? That trees, the world itself, is conscious and deserves to be treated as such. If at the base of the world is consciousness, just like us in some way, we can't as easily exploit it for our benefit. If other creatures experience pain, see color, love, have memories, then we have a moral obligation to protect them. In some sense, you might think panpsychism could make decision-making sticky if everything is conscious. How can we live our lives without disturbing something as alive? But we saw that this isn't exactly what panpsychism necessarily has to do. Panpsychism can run in line with a better science that includes the crucial data of our experience, of other creatures' experience of the world. Here, panpsychism both provides a base to branch off and study the behavior of creatures, as creatures possible of consciousness, of creatures possible of feelings. Other types of metaphysical views, as we've also seen, tend to restrict what types of creatures count as conscious, as well as restricting our ability to treat each other as beings capable of experiencing the complicated world in all its splendor and beauty. If the world is conscious and more complicated beings with their particles aligned in certain ways exhibit more complicated forms of consciousness, we should at the very least treat the world in a way that it respects its foundations. The world is in us, and we are in the world. We are the same stuff arranged in different ways. Some of the creatures have awareness that is more than just perceptual, capable of feeling love, pain, and longing. Strange loops and strange loops and strange loops in meaning, found in the nothingness of clay and sulfur and carbon and conscious thought capable of overcoming these basic atomic restrictions. Expanding our bubble of knowledge can hopefully provide the starting point to expand our moral considerations of creatures that are unlike us. Because just because a bug looks gross, just because a computer system necessarily seems so different than you, just because you don't think that animals can feel pain in the same way you can, we are all conscious at the base, capable of the same sort of awareness. The universe and the stars exploded billions of years to make you, to make the world. The world, it deserves a bit more respect, because we aren't the center, just a small part. Now, how do we get to this point? How do we get to the point where people can see the world accurately for what it is? I spent a lot of time on the genealogical biases and how these influence the way we can and cannot see the world as being true, or how we can see things as true or not. If sort of genealogy influences the way I've outlined as above, it seems like it is not an easy task to just believe a theory that is so different than the common beliefs of our time. If scientists and philosophers can be influenced by these beliefs, despite many times trying to see the truth, then how do we get everyone to jump on board? Let's go back to how we create knowledge for a bit. Beyond the criteria for establishing what counts as knowledge is deciding how to structure our worldview with that knowledge. Successful representational interventions have a Janus-based structure. This is a quote from Mia Srinivasan. Successful representational interventions have a Janus-based structure. They must at once picture the world right, as it is currently constituted, and yet also picture it anew, as one would have it be. A representational intervention, the introduction of a new concept, sexual harassment, compulsory heterosexuality, or the application of an old universal to a new particular, silencing to what pornography does to women, rape to forced marital sex, must strike a fine balance between familiarity and departure. Too familiar and it will be a recapitulation of what came before, too strange and it will be unintelligible. In this, representational interventions are like all creative acts. And as with other creative acts, it is not clear that world-making is best carried out by those who self-consciously aim to achieve certain effects or advance certain principles. Successful world-makers often appear to be people, we might call them moral prophets, who simply see the world as no one else yet sees it. Such people are truth-makers who speak and act as truth-tellers, who speak and act as if they are genealogically lucky. World-making power is governed, not by self-conscious pragmatism about representational change, but by an insistence on describing the world as she sees it, and offering account of the power of critical genealogy. History matters for philosophy. It's the prophets and not the mere pragmatists who are the most powerful world-makers. Now, this quote may give us some pause about if we ever can have interventions that allow us to see the world the right way. But I disagree. I think that if we start shifting the world that we exist in, then we allow everybody to be genealogically lucky and to see the world for what it truly is. And there is only one political system, one political arena that puts all people at an equal position to gain knowledge and to see the world for what it truly is, and that is an anarchist political system. The processes of science and data collection have worked to ignore the truth and places people in arbitrary hierarchies. We've seen throughout this discussion that many of the problems with most of the theories of consciousness is the hierarchies inherent within them. Dualism places the soul at the center of the universe. Functionalism reduces people to inputs and outputs. All these theories have their roots in exploitative environments where people were influenced by the negative social mores of their environment. Capitalism, feudalism, and other similar systems are not the environments to create representational structures to form language, to think in ways that allow us to investigate the underlying truth of the world. Anarchism seems to be the only system that allows us to structure our knowledge of the world in a way that gives everyone the genealogical luck to see the structure undergirding reality. The political system gives everybody an equal opportunity to look at the information, the data, and see the world for what it is. A system that displaces hierarchies is the only thing that does this. Anarchism is a system that at its core treats everyone as if they are conscious creatures. Anarchism looks to give everyone an equal share in the decision making. It is the process of creating a stateless, moneyless collective organized in the pursuit of a common goal. This system can be more obviously expanded so people can live in tandem with the environment. What does this mean for you, you might ask again? Well, we've discovered the demons at the center of the tunnel obscuring our viewpoint. Genealogy works in self-propagating loops. By this I mean that by shifting your metaphysics to one that is panpsychism, that makes it easier to see the world in all of its beauty. On the other hand, workers' revolutions that place humans in the center of the political sphere, also make more people in a lucky genealogical position to see the world for what it really is. A world where we don't exploit the fundamental building blocks of the world as possible. It starts with imagination, and it starts with situating ourselves in a dynamic that doesn't fundamentally obscure the truth. It starts with humans seeing ourselves as what we are, conscious creatures. By conscious creatures, interconnected in a beautiful whole. Hello, that is the end. If you made it this far, thank you very much for listening to me talk for an hour. And if you would like, do all the YouTube stuff, comment, subscribe, yada yada yada. This video was really fun to make, and I had some extra time after I graduated. So if you want to see more stuff like this, if people like it, maybe support me on Patreon, and I'll see if I can make something like this again. And let me know if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on any other topic. Otherwise, let's see, I put some links below with some of the sources I used if you want to check out more information about any of the topics in the video. And I put some links to some videos that inspired me and that I also used as sources of information. So thanks again for making it all the way to the end, and have a good rest of your day.